Okay, well, we're back for part two, where we're going to begin to look at some different ethical theories. We're going to dive right on in. We've looked at our roadmap of ethics. If you recall, that roadmap began with asking the question: do universal moral principles exist? Do universal moral principles exist? If you answer that yes, then you end up in the area of objective ethics. Whereas if you answer that no, you end up in the area of subjective ethics. Today, the first view that we're going to look at is that of subjective ethical relativism, which falls squarely in the view of subjective ethics. So we're going to look at that whole side of the board today. It all views pertaining to subjective ethics. Okay, so the first view under subjective ethics that we'll look at, remember these are views that answer the question no. They say no, there's no such thing as a universal moral principle. There may be, now that doesn't mean that there are no such thing as moral principles. It's just that no moral principle is universal. It doesn't apply. No moral principle applies to everyone of all place, of every culture, of all times. But moral principles can still be useful. And so the first view that we're going to see here is that of subjective ethical relativism. Subjective ethical relativism. This view is also called individual relativism. And so that's another one that while you're reading different books you might see as well. But subjective ethical relativism basically says that morals are a matter of personal opinion. That's basically the synopsis of it. That basically your commitments, your opinions, that's what makes up your morals, and that's those are the only morals that are possible for you, are those that you hold as good or bad. So what you believe to be right for you is right for you, while you believe what you believe to be wrong for you is wrong for you. My idea of right and wrong governs my morals, and so my opinion of right or wrong is what I live by, and that's the way it should be, because there's nothing outside of that we can appeal to for good or bad. It's just a matter of personal opinion. David Hume was a philosopher who reasoned this way. David Hume says that incest, for example, is only wrong because people don't like it. To give you a little background on that statement, basically David Hume was bringing up he made the illustration that said this. He says, look, is incest right or wrong? And of course, a human being would say, well, that's totally wrong. And we might even give good reasons why. We might say, because it affects the genetic makeup of the offspring, or, maybe we just say it's gross or whatever. Incest, is incest right or wrong? Well, could you imagine though? Could you imagine animals in the wild? Would we look at animals in the wild who are, say a pack of dogs, let's say a litter of dogs? In that litter, one of the male dogs grows up and one of the female dogs grows up, and they end up having puppies together. Is that wrong? Is it wrong for that dog, those two dogs, to commit incest? We probably wouldn't think anything of that. They're dogs. I mean, dogs do what dogs do, right? They're not humans. They don't have this rational capacity. Well, Hume says, look, if incest is wrong, then it's wrong for everybody and everything, regardless of culture, regardless of species. It's going to be wrong for everything. Now, I'm not agreeing with what Hume says, but this is what Hume says. If it's wrong for everybody. We don't think it's wrong for anybody else or anything else except for the human race. Basically, all that we're saying, says Hume, when we say that it's wrong, is that we don't like it, that it's gross to us, or that we don't like the effect that it produces in the offspring. Basically, it's when we say that something is good, all that we're saying with that is that we do like it. So when we say that generosity is good, well, it's because we have experienced the experience of giving to others, and that feels good, and maybe we've been on the other end of generosity, and somebody's been generous to us, and that feels good, and so generosity is good because we like it. Really, that's all we're saying about it, is that, in my opinion, it's good, or in my opinion, it's bad. So that's That's what Hume believes, and that's what he teaches. And it's a form of subjective ethical relativism. Excuse me. Now, if we were consistent with this, though, think about this. If we were consistent with the idea that what's good for you is good for you, and what's good for me is good for me, what would this view mean for our justice system? What would happen to our justice system as a result of this view? There's a teacher that I listen to from time to time, quite a bit. His name is Vodi Bakum. Vodi is a preacher. Vodi also is a sort of an amateur MMA fighter, and he was giving this series of talks called "The Ever Loving Truth," and he put it like this. He said he was engaging this issue of moral relativism, of the idea of subjective ethical relativism. And he says, you know what? He says, when people tell me that morals are subjective, it makes me really mad. He says, next time that somebody comes up to me and tells me that morals are relative, I'm going to punch him in the face. And this dude's pretty big, too. He's 6'4", 6'5", something like that. Big guy, MMA fighter. He says, I'm going to punch him in the face if they tell me that morals are bad or that morals are relative. And he says, when they pick themselves up off the floor and they look at me and with blood streaming down their mouth, they say, why did you do that? I'm going to say, well, it was good for me. It felt good to me to do it. If morals are relative and it felt good to me, then that's why I did it and it's moral to do it. So do you still believe that morals are relative? And if they say yes, I'm going to punch them in the face again. Now, I certainly don't advocate punching anybody in the face when they disagree with you about morals, but you kind of get the idea of what he's saying here. Look, if everybody consistently lived by the idea that the only morality out there is a person's personal opinion, then how could we ever justify putting someone on trial for murder? Because presumably if they committed the murder, then at some level that murder felt good to them or right to them. And who are we to argue with their morals? Well, I don't really think that anybody lives consistently with that, or can. Now, that's one of the big drawbacks to this particular system, is that we love to tell people, look, don't judge me, when in reality we make moral judgments all the time. Nobody, if they're honest, is really consistent with this view. In fact, if they are, then this view is going to necessarily devolve into a view known as moral nihilism. And basically, moral nihilism is the idea that there are no morals, that morals are superfluous, that they're just not even necessary and they're non-existent, so we don't even need to talk about them. Morals are a matter of taste and a matter of opinion. And the problem with nihilism is that when we lose ethical value, you will recall that ethics falls under axiology, the study of value. That when we lose the concept of moral value, we also lose something of meaning, what it means to be a moral creature, what it means to be civilized, what it means to be to love someone. I mean, what is love if there's no value? What is dignity if there's no value? What is integrity if there's no value? And when we lose all of that, then we're left in an ocean of nothing. And that's what nihilism takes us, ultimately. So it's very difficult to see how one avoids becoming a nihilist altogether if we espouse the view of subjective ethical relativism. But that is one view that's out there, and it's one view that people will say with their mouth, even if they don't live consistently with it in their life. The next view that we're going to look at is the view of it's in the realm of subjective ethics. It's the view of conventional ethical relativism. Now, this view has different names depending on what author you're reading or what philosopher you're reading. Some will call this conventional ethical relativism or conventionalism. Others will call this cultural relativism. That's probably what you'll catch me calling it, because that's the way I learned it when I was learning philosophy, in earlier days. But cultural relativism, conventional relativism, basically, this view says that morals come from individual cultures. Morals come from individual cultures, and so it's not necessarily individual persons or people who say what's good for me is good for me, what's good for you is good for you. It's different cultures, and so each culture represents a sort of sealed off circle, if you will, that where good and bad are judged by principles that evolve from within this cultural context. Mary Migdally is a philosopher who refers to this as moral isolationism, and the reason being is because she believes that these different moral systems are isolated from one another based on their cultures. And so what is wrong or right in the United States, for example, might be quite different than what's wrong or right, let's say, in Afghanistan or someplace like that. Right and wrong are just are functions of the culture from within which these actions are viewed or are taking place. Morals come from individual cultures. So basically each society has its own individual set of right and wrong. Now, as an observation, we would readily agree with that, right? If we just observe around us that there are different approaches to right and wrong in various cultures, that I think we could probably pretty much agree with that. However, this view is not without challenge, and we'll take a look at that. Now, before we do that, let's dive into a little bit of the argument for conventional relativism, and understand that the argument is seeking to prove that universal principles don't exist. Okay, it's not assuming that up front; it's trying to prove that, and so conventional relativism is going to try to prove that based on two premises that we'll look at. The first premise is the diversity thesis. Premise number one is the diversity thesis. And the diversity thesis says this. It says different cultures have different moral practices. That's almost self-evident, right? Different cultures have different moral practices. That's number one, thesis number one. For example, some people will point to, I think it was Ruth Benedict who pointed out, she was quoting an ancient Greek historian, and she was pointing out an example of this, and she says, in this histories, one of the stories that's related is this: there was a king named Darius. He was a Persian emperor. Basically, what an emperor is an emperor is a king of kings. It's a king under whom there are other kings, and so he rules over various sets and nations and cultures of people. And so King Darius is having court one day, and in walks a number of a couple of different people groups. One of them is a group called the Calaitians, and they're from an Eastern sort of Asian subculture. And then another group of Greeks come in, and Greeks, of course, are a European culture. Very different in the way that they view life, very different in their cultural practices. So these two groups are standing before King Darius. And Darius says, I'm curious. He says to the Greeks, he says, when someone dies in your culture, what do you do with them? How do you manage that? How do you honor that person or do away with the body, if you will? And the Greeks say, well, King Darius, here's what we do. We create an elaborate funeral pyre, and basically a pyre is like a large wooden table, right? It's made out of sticks and brush and flammable stuff. And we wash the deceased, we wash his body, and we lay him out on the funeral pyre. And then we place 2 golden coins on his eyes, and then we set the fire, we set the funeral pyre ablaze, and we stand there in honor of the one who has died, so as their body is consumed by the flames. Well, the Calaitians are noticeably upset at this point, and they're visibly shaken at what's going on. They can't believe they're murmuring among themselves when they hear what the Greeks do. and they're upset about this, and they're like, what's going on? We can't believe this. And Darius kind of hushes them down, and he says, well, we've heard what the Greeks do. What do you do, Galatians? What do you do with the bodies of those who have passed away in your culture? And the Galatians, they say, oh, King Darius, we would never do what those Greeks do with the bodies of those who have died and those loved ones. We can't believe the kind of blasphemy that is taking place there. Okay, well, you wouldn't do that. What do you do, says King Darius. Well, what we do agree that one should wash the body. But to burn it up? No, we would never burn it up. Because that would be a complete waste. Instead, what we do is we eat the body of those who have died and that we love, we want to honor. And of course, you can imagine the response of the Greeks, because it's probably the same response that you're having right now. Who wants to go to a funeral dinner with the Galatians? Anybody? No, I don't think so. It's pretty disgusting. Cannibalism is what it is. And Darius concludes, and he concludes by saying, culture is king. In other words, what Darius was saying was that, look, different cultures have different moral practices. This is obvious. That's premise number one, the diversity thesis. Premise number two is the dependency thesis. And the dependency thesis says this: whether an act is right or wrong depends upon the culture within which that act takes place. Whether or not an act is right or wrong depends upon the culture within which that act takes place. So, let me ask this question: is it wrong, morally or right, for a woman to drive a car? Is it wrong or right for a woman to drive a car? Well, since we live in the United States of America in the year 2018 so far, and I know all kinds of women who have driver's license, and the law permits to not only to drive, but gives their blessing. In fact, insurance companies